Did you know that the average high school romance lasts about 3 weeks? Well, Katie Thomas and Greg Hollander completely shattered that record by about 40 years. They met when she was a freshman and he was a sophomore, and from that moment on, they became inseparable. Yes, they had that true, mythical love that seemed to have stood the test of time. I have to tell you, Kat and I were married for about 30 of those years, and I thought we were truly happy. Our marriage was fulfilling, and when Kathy gave birth to our daughter Joan, it brought us even closer. In those years, I was content, or so I thought. Let me catch you up on this story. I'm Thomas Marsh, and Katie is my loving wife of 30 years. As I mentioned earlier, Kat and Greg dated throughout high school. Yes, she lost her virginity to Greg, and while we all know high school romances eventually end, this one didn't end so much as it went on a temporary hiatus. Since Greg was a year ahead of Katie, he decided to make a lot of money after high school so he could marry her. That's what my wife says, and she said it often throughout our marriage. After graduation, Greg worked on a pipeline in Alaska with his uncle, and that's where trouble began. He stopped writing to Kat shortly after arriving, leaving her alone during her senior year. She briefly dated someone named Sam, or maybe it was Simpson, but it was never serious. Her heart still belonged to Greg. She waited faithfully, but he remained absent, lost in his own world of work and adventure, thinking that Kathy would still be waiting for him. Well, that didn't happen. Life kept moving and nothing stayed the same. Katie went to college, earned her degree, and met me at a party when she was 24. I was a little older at 29, but we made a great couple. I fell in love with her the moment we met, and I thought she felt the same. Our marriage was normal, but there was one hiccup just 2 days before the ceremony. A letter arrived from Greg. Like the prodigal son, he was finally returning home and wanted to meet her. Thank God, Kat's mother dissuaded her from meeting him, reminding her that she had a new life to focus on. She called Greg after some emotional moments and, after some anxiety, decided to go through with the wedding. She became Mrs. Kathy Marsh. When Greg finally showed up, it was too late. We were already on our honeymoon. In a fit of despair, he apparently enlisted in the Marines. After we returned from our honeymoon, we settled into our new lives. Kat as a nurse and me as an insurance adjuster. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was stable and it paid the bills. Our marriage was strong, but there was one small issue. Greg began texting Katie, and she responded happily. When I asked her about it, she became indignant. "Oh, Tom, don't be jealous. He's an old friend. He's single in the Marines, and I'm just writing to keep his spirits up." I couldn't pretend I didn't know. I knew they were exchanging messages regularly, but neither her family nor I could convince her to stop until she received a letter saying Greg had married a girl while stationed overseas. That ended the correspondence, and for 3 peaceful years, everything seemed fine. During that time, our daughter Joan was born. With our baby in hand, Kathy and I worked hard to build a home and farm so Joan could have a good life. Life was good, but, as always, something came along to ruin it. One day, Katie received another letter from Greg. She never talked about it, but I noticed an increase in our stamp consumption after that. I suspected she was writing to him again, but I ignored it. After all, Greg was out there making the world safe while I was at home keeping my family safe. If they wanted to write to each other, I figured it was their business. I started to get a sense of what was going on when Kat began sharing some of the details she had gotten from Greg. He'd divorced his first wife, remarried, and then divorced again. He had seen battle and was apparently highly decorated. I listened with half an ear, but Kat spoke with such pride about her soldier. I corrected her, saying he'd be upset if she called him a soldier. He was a Marine. Katie giggled sweetly. "Oh, I think I better watch this." Hearing her talk about him really depressed me, but I still hoped that someday she would finally forget about him and focus on her family. Unfortunately, she never did. Greg had served in the Marines for 30 years, been married and divorced 3 times, and now had enough medals to make General Patton jealous. I realized with growing horror that while Greg had become more charming over the years, I had only grown older and more predictable. My only hope was that when Greg was discharged from the Marines, he'd live far away from us. Unfortunately, he didn't, and that's where we are now. Joan, our daughter, is grown up and married to a great guy, Frank Campbell. Another piece of good news. They're expecting their first child. I'm now 60 and looking forward to turning 65, so I can retire and enjoy my last few years in peace. Katie still looks great, and she can still make my heart skip a beat. But little did I know, the peace in my life would soon be shattered. It was Thursday when I returned home to find Kat dressed to the nines, telling me we had a dinner reservation at 7 o'clock. At first, I thought I had forgotten an anniversary or a birthday, but after doing some quick calculations, I realized that wasn't the case. I played along, went to our bedroom and cleaned myself up, trying to look presentable. Dinner was excellent, and the restaurant was packed, which made me think Kat had something else on her mind besides just good food. Toward the end of the meal, I looked at her and said, "Okay, now you can drop the bomb. I'm in a good mood, and I won't make a scene. One of my quirks is that I never get angry in public. Working for an insurance company taught me to keep my cool, and that habit spilled over into my personal life. Kat knew this, so whenever she had something upsetting to tell me, she'd take me to a public place to break the news. That night, I could tell something was off by the look on her face. After 30 years together, you learn how to read your spouse. My instincts told me this was going to ruin my night. With trepidation, Kat finally spoke the words I'd been dreading. "Tom, I think you should know that Greg is back." I suddenly felt nauseous, but I was sure it wasn't the food I'd just eaten. I stared at her for a moment, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Kat just looked at me thoughtfully. I broke the awkward silence, asking, "When you say back, do you mean on vacation?" She shook her head slowly and said quietly, "No, Tom, he's not on vacation. He was discharged from the Marines and bought a house 2 streets away from us." My panic level skyrocketed. I quickly asked, "And he's going to live there with his, what, 3rd wife?" She shook her head again, her voice barely audible. "No, he's divorced again. But this time, he had to lose part of his pension because of her." I tried to suppress my anger, but it was hard. "Crap," I muttered a bit too loudly. Some of the people at the next table looked at me, surprised. My anger wasn't about Greg losing part of his pension, but because he'd moved closer to us and I needed to understand why. I became more assertive. "Katie, you haven't met Greg, have you?" The expression on her face answered that question without her saying a word. She didn't even respond when I asked her my next question. "When and how, Katie?" She looked down, her voice subdued. "Yesterday. He stopped by to tell me that we're now neighbors." My heart was racing, and I continued, terrified of what I might hear next. "Did you sleep with him, Kat?" Once again, her face spoke volumes before she finally blurted out, "I did, Tom, but it's not what you think." I stared deep into her eyes, almost growling. "I think my faithful wife slept with someone other than her husband. Now explain to me why this is not what I think." She sighed and, with great reluctance, explained, "I did it because he needed me, Tom. When he came to me, he looked so lost. He's going through some anxiety or something because of his divorce, and he needed me badly. I tried to help him. I love you, Tom, but I realize I still love Greg too." I looked her straight in the eyes and spoke as decisively as I ever had in our entire marriage. "Okay, Kat, the damage is done. We can get through this and rebuild our lives, but you can never sleep with him again. Do you understand me?" She looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes, and responded quietly but firmly. I can't promise that, Tom. I love him, and he needs me even more than you do. I was shocked to hear those words, but I knew this wasn't the place to air our dirty laundry. We were in a public restaurant, and I wasn't about to make a scene. I called the waiter and asked for the bill. 10 minutes later, we were in the car, heading home. I pressed her again. Kat, how can you sleep with him knowing you have a husband? Have you forgotten those vows we made almost 30 years ago? Do you remember the part about forsaking all others? She started crying openly, her sobs breaking through. I'm sorry, Tom, but he needs me. We found each other again, and I can't bear the thought of losing him or you. I was stumped, unsure of what to say or do to make her let him go. My voice took on a hint of anger as I asked, well then, what do you suggest? Do we alternate days? He gets you for New Year's, and I get you for Christmas. She stopped sniffling and gave me a strange look. How about a vacation, Tom? I was taken aback. What the hell are you talking about, Kat? She moved on to a different topic. Remember about 18 years ago when you took a year off to go back to school and get your master's degree? You did what you needed to do and came back to your old job, and everything was fine. I shook my head irritably. Kat, how can you compare me getting a degree that benefited the company and our family with your involvement in this? This only benefits you too. We pulled into the driveway, and I turned off the engine. Kat reached over, gently touching my face. Please, Tom. I missed my last year of high school with Greg. If I had that year, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation tonight. Give me this year, and I promise you I'll get rid of Greg. I'll be the best wife I can be. I need this time, Tom, please. I was sad, hurt, shocked, and depressed. I wanted to grab her by the neck and squeeze until her eyes went dark. But then I remembered all the stories about prison and how cuckolded husbands lose their freedom and property. With a heavy heart, I said, okay, Kat, if this is what you want, go ahead and do what you like. But don't ask me to sanction it. And just to be clear, I don't want to see or hear from you in any capacity for the entire year. Is that clear? And know that in a year, you may have no one to return to. I hoped the harsh parameters I set for her vacation would dampen her enthusiasm, but she didn't seem to hear a word I said. She kissed me on the cheek and said, okay, thank you, Tom. You'll see you won't regret it. I shook my head. It's too late. I already regret it. That night, she wanted to make love to me, but I just ignored her. The thought of her with Greg made me feel sick. I didn't want to be physically intimate with her. As we were getting ready for bed, I grabbed a pillow and told her I was sleeping in the guest room. I saw the hurt in her eyes, and I was glad. Maybe now she would reconsider what this vacation would lead to. The next morning, I woke up, praying that the events of the previous night were just an aberration and that Kat would think differently in the light of day. I was wrong. When I walked into the kitchen, she was preparing breakfast, looking like she had just won the lottery. She smiled at me and pointed to the calendar hanging on the wall. I couldn't help but notice that today's date, June 6th, was surrounded by a thick black line. I sat at the table, reflecting on the irony of the date. In 1944, thousands of soldiers and sailors fought to free Europe from a tyrant. Today, I lost my wife to another oppressor. Kat was almost dizzy with excitement when she brought me breakfast, placing it in front of me. I know you're worried, my love, but in a year from today, I'll return to you, and I'll be only yours. I really need this time to think about everything, to clear it from my head. I promise you, you won't regret it. She smiled contentedly, but then added, I called Greg this morning while you were still sleeping. I told him everything about how you gave me permission to go on vacation, and he's going to pick me up in an hour. I had to give her another chance. Kat, you don't have to do this. I wish you'd think more carefully before making such a stupid decision. You can't be sure that in 1 year you'll be able to cope with this clown. You just need to get him out of your head and focus on getting our marriage back on track. Please, don't risk destroying us. She smiled at me as if I were a fool and said kindly, Tom, I know how much you love me. By giving me this time, you're showing me that you trust me. I know what I'm doing, and I will come back to you. Our marriage will be even stronger. Then, with a final, sweet smile, she added, Now I need to finish packing, honey. Please, finish your breakfast. And just like that, she walked out of the kitchen, as if for all intents and purposes, our marriage was already over. I finished eating, even though my food had no taste, and went to our bedroom to get dressed. As I walked in, I noticed that Kat had 3 large suitcases packed with her clothes and toiletries. She smiled at me tenderly. I think I have everything I need, she said. Please, take these bags to the porch for Greg. I looked at her blankly before responding, No. Her face fell as she was shocked by my refusal. I continued firmly, Listen, if you're hellbent on ruining 30 years of marriage, you and he can take your bags together. There's no way I'll help you get into this mess. She looked like she was about to cry, but answered irritably, Greg is a wonderful man, a hero who served our country. This is more than you've ever done. I turned away, muttering, Yes, he received medals, 3 meals a day, and traveled the world. Meanwhile, I worked 5 days a week to provide for you and our daughter. Guess you're right. None of it meant anything. Kat lugged all her luggage down the stairs to the driveway, throwing me dirty looks with every bag. A few minutes later, a car pulled up to our house, and a man, who I could only assume was Greg, got out and started loading her things. Kat shouted to him that she'd be right there, then returned to the house to say goodbye to me. We stood there awkwardly, and I was the first to break the silence. If you're really going to do this stupid thing, remember the ground rules. I don't want to see or talk to you for this entire year. It was starting to sink in for her what this might mean. She meekly replied, I understand, Tom, but everything will work out. You'll see. She paused, waiting for me to say something, but I remained silent. With a more confused expression on her face, she added quietly, I really love you. She leaned in to kiss me, but I turned away at the last second. She settled for touching my cheek. I can't kiss you, I said sharply, not knowing that you're going to him. She started crying and ran out of the house, straight into his arms. From the front door, I watched as she kissed him deeply, and rage rose from the depths of my soul. 2 minutes later, my driveway was as empty as my heart, and I realized my wife was now another man's woman. I called into work sick that morning and immediately went to the hardware store to get new locks. I spent the rest of the morning changing the locks on the house and reprogramming the security codes. The work kept me occupied, distracting me from thinking about Kat. But when I finished, the sadness hit me like a wave crashing onto the shore. Then, like any man in my position, I turned to the bottle. My drinking session was more about searching for relief from the pain than anything else, but it was a failure. I kept drinking until Sunday morning when I ran out of booze, which was probably a blessing, because I felt like I was dying physically, spiritually, and mentally. I went to bed and fell into a deep sleep, only to be woken by a knock somewhere in the house. Slowly, I stumbled out of bed to find the source of the sound. It turned out to be Joan, knocking on the front door. When I let her in, she looked shocked by my condition and the smell of alcohol hanging in the air. Her first words were, "What the hell is going on, Dad?" I tried to focus, but the sound of hammers pounding in my skull made it hard. I managed to croak, "What do you mean?" She grabbed me and led me to the kitchen. "You need some coffee and food, Dad." Then you can explain to me what caused all this." With food in my belly and coffee in hand, I told her everything I knew about her mother and Greg. "Dad," she said slowly, "let me make this clear. Does she want to take a year off from your marriage to reunite with her old high school boyfriend and let the romance run its course?" I nodded and replied, "Yes, something like that." Her next words were the same ones I had been asking myself since Friday. "What are you going to do, Dad?" I looked at her, and the words seemed to fall from my lips. "Tomorrow, I'll get sick again and go to the lake." Joan looked sad, her voice shaking as she said, "I can't believe Mom would do something like that. Maybe it's a mental disorder." I looked at her blankly, the words heavy on my tongue. "I have no idea, Joni." She gave me a look of sadness I had never seen before. "I don't know what to say, Dad. I want to tell you to think about it, but honestly, this sounds like your best option." Joan stayed with me for a few more hours and even prepared dinner for me to eat later. When she left, she kissed me and apologized again. As she was about to leave, I asked, "Why did you even show up here today?" She looked into my eyes, her expression serious. "Mom called and asked me to come and check on you, but she didn't tell me why or where she was." I nodded as if I understood. "Okay, thank you, and drive carefully, honey." On Monday, I really did get sick and also met with a lawyer. I was right in my judgment when I confronted Katie. The divorce was a decisive blow in my favor, thanks to her refusal, and it could prevent her from receiving half of my pension. However, other marital assets were still in play. Now, I was sure that taking a year off from Katie could be a good opportunity to liquidate those assets. The next 3 weeks flew by quickly. I was surprised at how quickly I adjusted to being alone. The positive side was that I felt a weight lifted from me. I no longer felt responsible for another person. The downside, of course, was waking up alone and coming home to an empty house. I didn't see or hear from Katie until mid-July. On Saturday, I went to Flynn's, an upscale tavern in our city, for a few drinks. I was sitting at the bar when they walked in, holding hands like two teenagers in love. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't even notice me sitting there. As I watched them, I paid particular attention to Greg. He was muscular and moderately attractive, and I could understand what Katie saw in him. But what struck me most was how he seemed to dominate her. She was hanging on his every word, listening intently as he spoke. When she stood up to go to the ladies' room, she finally saw me at the bar and gave me a shy smile. When she came back, she hesitantly approached me. "Hello, Tom. How are you doing?" I wanted to tell her to leave, but I maintained my composure and replied, "Oh, about as good as you can expect when your wife of 30 years just leaves you for some scumbag. What else can I do for you?" She seemed confused by my sarcastic response, but stood her ground. "Tom, I need to get into our house. I left some personal items there, and when I tried to come in the other day, my key didn't work." I smiled, keeping my tone friendly. "Well, Kat, you shouldn't be surprised that your key doesn't work in my house anymore, since you don't live there." She just stood there, looking at me with a confused expression on her face. I continued, "I think you'd better get back to your boyfriend before he starts worrying." I saw tears well up in her eyes as she turned and walked away. I went back to my drink, feeling oddly detached from the situation. A couple of minutes later, I felt a rough hand on my shoulder, and before I knew it, I was spun around to face a very annoyed Greg. "Hey, you made my woman cry, and I don't like it." I could feel the tension building, and my heart started to pound. Greg looked like he might hit me, and I realized that this guy could probably kill me before anyone had a chance to step in. But instead of backing down, I went on the offensive. "You're talking about my wife, not your woman," I said with more conviction than I felt. "And since you stole her, you don't get to tell me what happens between us now. I'll tell you straight, Hit me and impress her. But what will the cops think of you? I could see him thinking it through, and though Greg didn't seem like the brightest guy, I knew I had enough leverage to stand my ground. You've got two options, I continued. One, hit me and spend a couple of years in prison. Or two, get out of my sight and go sit on your stupid fifth place. My heart was still racing, and part of me screamed to stop. He could easily overpower me. But I maintained a facade of bravado as Greg stood there, weighing his options. Luckily, the manager came over and asked what the problem was. Greg glared at him but finally muttered, "No problem," before turning and retreating toward Katie. 5 minutes later, they paid the bill and left. That evening, as I drove home, I couldn't help but wonder what personal items Katie wanted from the house. I decided to find out. I pulled the boxes out of her bureau and, beneath them, found letters from Greg addressed to Katie. As I read them, it became painfully clear that this year with Greg had been in the works for a very long time. One letter, dated 5 years earlier, stated, "It's a relief to know you still miss me as much as I miss you. When I get home, I want us to be together, so you'll have to find some way to get rid of this weakling of a husband." Reading through the letters was like flipping through a trashy novel. Most of them detailed either what Greg intended to do to Katie or reminisced about their high school days. By the time I finished, life without Kat had already become much easier. I didn't see or hear from her until September 1st, my birthday. When I came home from work that day, I found a covered pot on the porch and a birthday card. Inside, I discovered that she had prepared a stew, my favorite dish. The card simply said, "Tom, I know we're not supposed to communicate, but I couldn't just ignore the birthday of the person I love so much. I dream about us at night, my love, and I know that when this year is over, I will be completely yours, and you will be mine. Please never stop loving me or abandon us. Kat." My daughter, Joan, had been keeping a close eye on me since Kat left. She called me on my birthday, and after some small talk, she finally got to the real reason for the call. "Dad, you know my due date is in 3 weeks, right?" she asked. "How could I forget? The birth of my first grandson," I responded. "Yes, I know, honey. You and Frank must be so worried." There was a brief pause before Joan spoke again, sounding more serious. "Dad, Frank and I went to dinner with Mom and Greg. Mom wants to be there when my baby is born, and she wants Greg to be with her. I know you and Mom agreed not to communicate for a year, but can you make an exception just this once?" I was a little taken aback to learn that Joan and Frank had dinner with them, but I didn't want to spoil the birth of my first grandchild. "Okay, Joan. She can come, and if she needs to, she can bring him with her," I said. Joan immediately corrected me. "Dad, stop calling him names. He's actually not such a bad guy, and he makes Mom really happy." I haven't seen her this happy in years. I was stunned, and then a wave of anger washed over me. "Your grandmother called him many years ago, and nothing has changed since then. First, you're all having lunch together, and now you're defending him? I don't know what he has in store, but I'm afraid soon he'll take my entire family away from me. Just out of curiosity, when are you going to start calling him Dad?" Joan quickly responded, regret in her voice. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to sound like that. I can imagine how you feel, and I'm truly sorry." I interrupted her apology, my tone cold. "It's okay. Forget about it. Listen, I have something in the oven that I need to take care of. Behave yourself." She said she loved me and hung up. It was probably then that I realized my life would never be the same, and it was time to start resisting. First, I needed to liquidate my assets to lower my net worth, and second, I needed to stop being afraid and start returning to the world again. The next few days were stressful. I got some legal advice about my assets and even bought a stun gun for self-defense. I decided that the next time Greg attacked me, I wouldn't be talking my way out of it. I also booked a trip to Vegas in October and began searching online for a woman my age who was looking for a stable, long-term relationship. As for my assets, I had a lot of leeway in how to distribute them. Since Kat no longer lived with me, I could spend or give them away however I pleased. When Joan gave birth, I was at work. My secretary answered the phone, and I was told by Frank that I now had a grandson. I congratulated him and said I would come to the hospital right away. When I arrived, I found out which room Joan was in and went straight there. As I approached the door, I overheard her talking to Kat. "Mom, what you and Dad are doing is incredibly pointless. Do you really want to lose him to Greg?" Kat's voice was soothing. "Don't worry, Joan. I'm not going to lose your father. He loves me too much to ever let me go. Besides, what I have now with Greg is amazing. It's hard to describe, but every day feels like high school again, only better. Now we can sleep together, and he treats me like a princess. He curls my toes every night. I've never had such a wonderful night in my life," Kat said. "I will truly miss this when I return to your father." Joan's voice sounded disgusted as she replied, "Mom, I don't want to hear about your nightlife with Greg. I admit he's an amazing guy, and you two seem well suited to each other, but I want my child to have grandparents who are together, not divorced or fighting. Please, Mom, you have to go back to Dad. You better do it before it's too late. He may be boring and predictable and definitely not in the same league as Greg, but Dad will always be there for you. Greg is a dreamboat, but sooner or later all boats sail. On the other hand, Dad is a rock. He'll never leave you if you do everything right. Beg him on your knees if necessary, but make him take you back." There was a moment of silence before Joan passionately pleaded, "Mom, don't wait too long or you'll lose him." Kat's voice, as usual, showed how wrong she really was. "You don't have to worry about your father and me. When the time comes that I'm done with Greg, he'll gladly take me back." Joan's voice was full of skepticism as she replied, "I understand that you think you know Dad, but I've seen him and talked to him. He's definitely changing and not for the better. He seems bitter and more distant since you left him. Are you really willing to risk 30 years of a good marriage to be with your high school sweetheart?" I'd heard enough, so I chose that moment to enter the room. I forced a smile and said, "Hey, Mommy, congratulations on your new son. You two must be thrilled." I walked over and hugged Joan but pointedly ignored Katie. I knew it was immature to ignore her, but it was becoming easier to do so. Katie gave me a dirty look, but Joan seemed delighted as she asked, "Have you seen him yet, Dad?" I shook my head. "No, baby. I just came to see how you were doing." Finally, tired of being ignored, Katie intervened with less than cordial words. "Hello, Tom. How are you doing?" I looked at her for a moment, then turned my attention back to Joan, asking about the birth and the baby's name. At the mention of the baby's name, Joan's face lit up. "Frank and I both agree we want to name our baby Thomas after you." It was at that point that Katie solemnly left the room, telling us she was going to see the baby. When she left, I took Joan's hands and held them, my tone serious. "Joan, you already know your mom and I probably won't work out." I saw the truth of my words hit her hard. "No, Dad, don't think that. She'll come to her senses and be home again." I felt my eyes mist as I continued, "Baby, I now understand that I was never enough for your mother. Something will happen soon." Shock and disbelief showed on Joan's face. "What? No, Dad." I smiled sadly. "In the near future, I'm going to start divorce proceedings after I've put things in order." She was in tears when she answered, "Oh, Dad, I told Mom that she should beg you to come back, but it's too late, isn't it?" I nodded in agreement. "Yes, I won't be able to take her back. The memories of her deception would be too much for me. But please, don't tell her anything yet. Okay? Joan nodded, pulling me toward her for a kiss. We talked for a few more minutes about a myriad of things, pointedly avoiding any mention of my wife or her lover. Finally, I told her I'd be back tomorrow and left her to look at the baby. I found my way to the children's ward and saw my grandson among the other babies. I was in awe of how small and precious he was, and I realized just how beautiful this moment was. Frank immediately walked toward me, standing between me, Katie, and Greg with a smile on his face. Frank handed me a cigar. "Here, Dad, smoke to celebrate." I put the cigar in my pocket and patted him on the back. "I'll leave this for later, son." "Thank you." Looking at my wife and her lover, holding hands like children, I felt sick. "Listen, Frank, I'll be back tomorrow when it won't be so crowded, and the air will be cleaner, if you know what I mean." Frank smiled knowingly. "I completely understand you, Dad, and I don't blame you at all." As I was about to leave, Kat called out to me, "God, Tom, it feels like just the other day we were bringing our baby home. Now it seems so strange that our baby has his own. I don't know where the time went, but it went too soon." I looked at her, still holding hands with Greg, and left the room without saying a word. She looked puzzled as I left them standing there. October came, and it turned out to be my best month since Katie left. I went to Vegas, initially with the intention of hitting the tables and losing money to reduce our joint assets. But what made the trip so enjoyable was the woman I met while I was there. Her name was Miranda, and she was a mature woman in her 50s. I was surprised that she was still in the profession, but she explained that many men wanted an older woman. Miranda was expensive, but she made me feel more alive than I had in years. For the first time since Kat left, I didn't really miss her at all. Miranda was great both in and out of bed, and she seemed genuinely interested in me. She asked me for all the details about my soon-to-be ex-wife and her new lover, and by the end of the night, she knew just as much about me as I did. Miranda was stunned by my story, and as we parted ways that evening, she gently stroked my face. "Tom, I've only known you for a few hours, but I want to tell you something. You're a good person, and that doesn't come around very often. Believe me, I've seen and been with thousands of men, and I can count on one hand the ones I really liked and respected. You're one of them. Your wife has no idea what she's missing. However, don't let her actions and stupidity change you. If you ever come back to town, give me a call. I'd really like to see you again." Miranda in Vegas left me more confused than when I arrived. I thought about her words and realized she was right. I was going to take revenge on Kat for betraying me, but even though she had been a good wife and mother for 30 years before the betrayal, I couldn't let it ruin me. I wasn't going to leave this marriage a broken man. When I returned from Vegas, I told my lawyer to start preparing divorce papers. I also decided I needed to find out more about Greg Hollander. On my lawyer's recommendation, I hired a firm to investigate his history from high school to the present. The firm was expensive, but I didn't care since half the cost would come from Katie's side. They assured me they'd have all the information I needed before Christmas. I also asked my boss about the possibility of moving to a branch office. At first, he was shocked because I'd always said I would never move, but that was when I still had a family. He told me he'd make inquiries and let me know. Thanksgiving was the next hurdle. Joan called me about a week before the holiday and asked if I would have dinner with them. When I asked if her mother and Greg would be there, she hesitantly answered yes. I firmly told her no and hung up. To my surprise, my brother-in-law called me next. Frank asked for a meeting, and we agreed to meet at a bar in the city center for a quiet drink. When we met, I could tell Frank was excited. After our initial greeting, I ordered 2 double Scotch whiskeys. I sensed that something was bothering him, so I sat back and let him speak. Dad, you won't believe it, but they are both crazy about him. All you hear is Greg this and Greg that. You'd think he was that guy from the beer commercial, the most interesting man in the world. I was surprised he'd come here tonight to persuade me to join them for Thanksgiving. So I asked, "Do I understand correctly, Frank, that you don't like Mr. Hollander?" Frank's face showed anger. "Dad, this man is arrogant, self-centered, selfish, and a lot worse. He's so in love with himself that I can't see where he has anything left for Katie." Realizing what he had just said, Frank's face fell, and he quickly apologized. "Sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to be disrespectful." I smiled at him. "Don't worry, son. Don't be offended. But when did you start calling her Katie instead of Mom?" He looked down, his voice heavy. "Since she left you. I've never had any respect for her since then." I was stunned by the raw honesty in his voice. "Now, I'm wondering, Frank, why does it bother you that she left me, if I may ask?" Frank's face burned with anger again. "I'm sure you've noticed that I never talked to you guys about my parents, and I appreciate that you never asked. The truth is, my mother cheated on my father. After that, my parents separated, and my father never got over it. He drank himself half to death, and my mother died in a car accident along with her lover. I don't like cheaters, and now that Katie's become one, I really can't stand her anymore. I'm pretending to be okay, but I'm worried." I had never known about Frank's parents before, and it made me feel his pain, but I was still puzzled by his anxiety. "Frank, you say you're worried. What's bothering you, son?" He took a long sip from his glass and ordered another, then turned to me. "I'm probably going to piss you off when I tell you this, but you asked. The old saying, like mother, like daughter, scares me. If Katie's turned into a cheater and keeps telling Joan how great it is, how long do you think it'll be before Joan tries something new too?" "I think I understand your point of view," I said, joining Frank and taking a long sip of my drink as I contemplated my next move. "Listen, Frank, don't be discouraged. I have a few surprises up my sleeve, and I think things may start to change in the new year. I also want to tell you, strictly between you and me, that I have some plans that should make this a good Christmas for you and Joan, but not for the others, if you know what I'm getting at." Frank smiled for the first time since we'd sat at the bar and spent the next 15 minutes questioning me, but to no avail. As we ended our meeting, I smiled again. "Are you forgetting something, Frank?" He looked puzzled. "What, Dad?" I took him by the shoulder. "Shouldn't you try to convince me to be a big boy and come to Thanksgiving?" Frank's smile spread across his face like a river flooding. "Sorry. Okay. Will you come to Thanksgiving, Dad?" I shook my head. "No, but I appreciate the invitation." Joan called me twice more before Thanksgiving, begging me to come, until I finally put it into perspective. "Look, Joan, when your mother left me because of this last June, I told her there would be no contact between us for the year. She wanted to end our marriage. I've already broken this rule once, at the birth of little Thomas, but I will not break bread with them. Is it clear?" The holiday came and I ate a frozen dinner. I was lonely and sad, but I was in a better place than if I had to watch Katie and Greg make eyes at each other. December arrived, bringing with it the specter of yet another family holiday. I feared it, but I knew it would be the last thing I'd have to endure. December turned out to be a fruitful month. First, the company offered me a position in Spokane, Washington, starting in January, if I was interested. I told them yes. Second, the private investigator's report on Greg Hollander came in, and it was amazing. Apparently, Greg had 3 wives, all of whom divorced him for adultery. Add to this 2 children from women other than his wives, for whom he was still paying child support, and the fact that his last wife received half of his pension in the divorce. The cherry on top was that Greg had been demoted from E8 to E6 during his last year in the Corps. In short, his financial and moral situation seemed weak, very weak. The latest good news was that Katie would receive her divorce papers on the first business day after Christmas. Yes, now I felt the old holiday spirit flowing through me. I called Joan and asked her about the plans for Christmas. She again begged me to make it a real family affair. I asked if Greg would be present, and Joan got angry. "Dad, you better get used to it. He's part of our family now, whether you like it or not." I stopped her abruptly. "You're right, I don't like it, but for the sake of the child, I will be there." Joan seemed truly happy as she shouted, "Thank you, Dad. This will make everyone so happy." I was pretty sure that wouldn't happen, but who was I to ruin the fun? 2 days later, after returning home from work, the phone rang. Without thinking, I picked up. "Hello." The line was awkwardly quiet, and I was about to hang up when a voice finally answered. "Tom, it's me, Katie." I was taken aback. "What happened?" "Katie, are you injured?" Her voice sounded timid as she spoke. "No, I'm fine, Tom, but I wanted to thank you for agreeing to come for Christmas. I know I hurt you, and I'm starting to realize how much. But I needed to tell you that I'm grateful, because in the last 30 years we've never been apart for a single holiday. I was miserable at Thanksgiving without you, and I've been thinking about us so much lately." I interrupted her trip down memory lane. "Well, Katie, I'm glad to hear that you do think about us from time to time, but I should point out that when you started this whole vacation nonsense, I stipulated that there would be no communication between us. I relaxed this rule for one day at Christmas, so I think we should end this conversation now. Goodbye." When I hung up the phone, I felt terrible. I had never spoken to her so harshly in all the 30 years of our life together. But as bad as I felt about what I said, it wasn't as bad as the day she left me. The month dragged by slowly, and I had plenty of free time to do my Christmas shopping. I wanted to make sure I had gifts for everyone. I also packed the things I was going to take with me to my new job and rented a car to drive across the country. I spoke to a nice woman at my new office who said she had picked out a couple of very nice furnished apartments near the office. The good news was that she would show them to me in person when I arrived in Spokane. Yes, everything was going well for me in December. I arrived at Joan and Frank's on Christmas Day to find that Katie and her lover had already gotten there. When I walked in with a bag of gifts, Joan grabbed me and hugged me tightly. She made a remark about what a surprise it was and then headed back to continue preparing dinner. I just smiled, thinking, if only she knew what a surprise this was. Frank shook my hand and took my coat as I quickly asked, "Can I see my grandson?" Frank nodded and told me the baby was sleeping in the nursery, but I could stop by. I quietly crept inside and looked at the sleeping figure in front of me. A river of emotion flowed through me, knowing that soon I would leave him, but I knew I couldn't stay. I felt movement behind me as Katie silently walked over and stood next to me. I sensed the irony that this was where she should have been since June, next to me. Katie looked at me and whispered, "We have a wonderful grandson, Tom." I was filled with sadness as I answered, "Yes, Katie. But who is he going to call Grandpa? Me, or the idiot, or both?" Katie seemed surprised by the question. "Why are you so stupid? You're the only grandfather this child will ever have." I muttered quietly, "Let's hope you're right, Katie," and then left the room. The next few hours were strange. Frank and I chatted while Joan, Kathy, and Greg seemed to be in their own little world. I was disappointed at how quickly my daughter had succumbed to Greg's charms. Frank just looked unhappy, but I told him to hang in there because things were going to change tonight. His eyes flashed as he said conspiratorially, "I hope so, Dad. I can't stand that idiot around her anymore. At this rate, he'll soon be playing with Joan." Dinner was served, and while the food was delicious, there was a lack of company. I didn't feel the need to engage in conversation with either my wife or her lover, and Frank seemed pretty reticent to speak up too. The only one who spoke was Greg, regaling the women with tales of his courage and perseverance in the face of the enemy. Watching Greg with his fawning fan club made me feel sick. After dinner, Joan brought the baby into the living room, and we all sat around together. I looked at my family, knowing this was likely the last time this family scene would play out in my life. Joan seemed happy as she excitedly told Frank to bring the gifts. When he brought them over, she handed them to her mom, Greg, and me. Katie got a sweater, Greg got a gift card, and I got a tie, useful, boring gifts just like myself according to my wife and daughter. When Frank, Joan, and the baby opened their gifts from Kathy and Greg, Joan smiled and laughed. But Frank's smile was polite but distant. Once everyone had finished opening their gifts, the room became a little quiet as they looked at me and my bag of gifts. Finally, I broke the silence by saying, "I want to end this wonderful weekend by giving you all the gifts you deserve on this holiday." I stood up to grab the bag I had brought and handed Frank and Joan large envelopes wrapped in nice holiday paper. Joan tore the paper off the envelope, and as she looked through the papers, she screamed with joy when she realized what it was. Katie shifted in her chair, eager to find out what the papers contained. Joan wasted no time in bringing her up to speed, shouting, "Oh, Mom! Dad gave us your house for free and without a mortgage. Now we can move out of this rental. Isn't that great?" Katie's face fell as she looked at me with concern. "Why did you do this, Tom? Where will we live?" I gave her a venomous look, hoping it would reach her heart. "Don't worry, Katie. I've thought of everything. Here, this is for you," I said, handing her a card in a wrapped box. There was a look of timid hope on her face as she tore open the brightly colored paper and found a bracelet inside. When she pulled it out, surprise written all over her face, I said, "Look at the inside, Kat." Greg didn't seem very happy with my gift. Katie slowly turned it over and saw the words, "Thank you for the best 30 years of my life, Tom." I looked at Greg, but he was still frowning. Katie looked confused. "Tom, thank you, dear. This is quite beautiful, but you forgot to write, 'with love.'" I smiled. "I didn't forget it, Kat. I just didn't want to lie. I've been steadily losing my love for you these past few months. This bracelet is my way of saying goodbye and will be a reminder of what you gave up for your freedom." I paused for a moment before adding, "I also need to tell you that you will be served with divorce papers on Monday." I clearly heard Joan take a deep breath, and Katie's face contorted with disbelief and despair. I nodded toward the postcard inside the card. "I tried to express my gratitude for the wonderful years you gave me and for giving me such a wonderful daughter." I handed over a check for half of our liquid assets. Of course, there aren't many, just $195. But I spent most of it during your absence. The house was meant to be given to my daughter when you voluntarily left our marriage, but that's all explained in the card too. I looked at Greg, thinking about the volcano that was about to erupt. "This gift is more for you too," I said, handing another large envelope to a clearly shocked Katie. "Inside is the full story of what your lover has been up to since you broke up in high school. I think you'll find this a fascinating read." Before I could finish my sentence, Greg roared, growling menacingly, "I'll kill you, you son of a—" Greg never actually managed to hurt me. He hit the floor hard when my stun gun hit him. Joan and Katie stood up as Greg convulsed, and I tossed him one more time before Frank nervously intervened. "You better not do that again, Dad. You might kill him." I stood up, looking down at my convulsing nemesis and then at the two women I loved more than life itself. "I'll leave now. Thank you for a wonderful day, and for a wonderful life, since I won't see you both for quite a long time. Most likely never." Both women seemed speechless, staring at me as if they no longer knew who I was. Frank brought my coat and handed it to me with a satisfied smile on his face. Before leaving, I turned once again to my daughter, who for the first time in her life was looking at me with fear in her eyes. Joan, let this serve as a warning to you. If you go the way your mother did, you will pay the consequences just like she did. You'll lose your husband, your home, your possessions, and the love of your life. I walked up to the cradle where little Tom was looking up at me. I rubbed his cheek with my finger. Bye, baby. Maybe we'll see each other again someday. But for some reason, I feel that most likely not. Still smiling, I headed towards the door and, turning to the silent room, simply said, "Happy New Year, guys." By the time I reached my car, the women's shock must have worn off, or maybe they'd returned to their duties. But I clearly heard one plaintive voice shout, "No, this can't happen to me." As I got in and started the engine, I thought about how Vegas was on the way to Spokane, and I wouldn't mind seeing Miranda again. As I backed out, Frank came outside, smiling and waving at me, and I waved back before heading west to a new life. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to JK Tells a Story for more tales.